I'm going to introduce Julian David Stone. He has been a creative at heart forever. When he realized in the 1980s that being in a band wasn't in his cards, he pivoted. He began smuggling his camera into concerts and adventures that he later chronicled in his best-selling coffee table book, No Cameras Allowed: My Career as an Outlaw Rock and Roll Photographer. That's not on sale tonight, but you might want to look that up too. He moved to Los Angeles in his 20s to study filmmaking and wrote screenplays for Disney, Paramount, Sony, and MGM, as well as a full-length play called The Elvis Test. Wonder what that's about. And several short-form documentaries on Frank Sinatra for Warner Brothers. His latest work that we are profiling today, the historical fiction novel, It's Alive, is a vibrant portrait of 1930s Hollywood centered around the chaotic and exciting days just before the filming of the beloved classic film, Frankenstein. Happy Halloween, and please give Julian David Stone a warm welcome.
Yes, I've had kind of a varied career doing all sorts of different things, and I'm just really excited to be here. I want to thank Culver City for asking me to do this. My name is indeed Julian David Stone. I am the author of the novel It's Alive, about the making of the original 1931 Frankenstein. And I was very excited when they asked me to do this presentation about movie makers and movie monsters, because tonight we're going to talk about Irving Thalberg and Carl Laemmle Jr., two of the greatest producers of films from the golden age of Hollywood. Irving Thalberg, of course, is very, very well known. Carl Laemmle Jr., not so much, and I've kind of made it a mission of mine to make him more well known because I don't believe he's gotten the due that he deserves. Now, they both had storied careers. We're not going to talk about everything. We're going to focus on their horror productions because we're here at Halloween. And as I mentioned, I've done a lot of stuff on Carl Laemmle Jr. and Thalberg. I'd done a little bit when writing the novel, but when I was asked to do this presentation, it gave me a great opportunity to do a deep dive into Irving. And it was great because what I discovered was a lot of similarities between the two of them. Both were put in charge of movie studios at the ridiculously young age of 21. Both of them, crazy. Both of them were rather short, diminutive in height, something that would get mentioned. And one, most importantly, for why we're here and which informed their work, they both had to deal, frankly, with the specter of death at a very, very young age. It was something that affected both of them and, again, affected their work. And then lastly, and perhaps the most important thing that they had in common was the fact that this man, Carl Laemmle Sr., gave them their start in the film business. Do we want to turn the lights down, or did you want to leave them? Yeah, or can you see the screen okay? Or oh, okay, then. Yeah, I think that's a little better. Okay, as I was saying, and they also had in common, Carl Laemmle Sr. gave them their start in the film business. And Carl Laemmle, of course, was the founder of Universal Studios. And he was different than most of the other moguls that started this wonderful business that we all are celebrating. He did not quite have the hardscrabble life that so many of them did. In fact, when he entered the film business, he was living a very comfortable middle-class life in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He was almost 40. He had a family. He had a great white-collar job working at a department store. And with all of the success, though, that he had, he was even a pillar of society there, he decided to throw it away and enter the brand new film business. And he did this in 1906 by first buying the White Front Theater. This was a Nickelodeon, typical theater of the time. He bought it in 1906, and things went very well. Within the first year, he had 3 theaters. Within 2 years, in 1908, he formed a film exchange, wasn't satisfied with just theaters, he started distributing films himself. And then from there, in 1909, he formed the Independent Moving Picture Company, or the IMP, and started making films. Then in 1912, as me and Mark Wanamaker were talking about, he joins with several other small companies and forms Universal Films. That leads to 3 years later the establishment of Universal City Studios on the spot that it is to this day. Pretty impressive in 9 years to go from entering the film business to now being one of the largest producers of movies in the United States. Well, despite the fact that filmmaking was now moving almost entirely out to the West Coast, the business part of the film business was still very much on the East Coast. And the Laemmles at the time were living at this was their residence, 378 West End Avenue. And this was a very fortunate thing for the Thalbergs because they happened to live in the fabulous borough of Brooklyn. And in fact, Irving Thalberg was born there, Irving Grant Thalberg, on May 30th, 1899. And he's the first child of William Thalberg and Henrietta Thalberg. And he also comes from kind of a good middle-class background, but he had a very, very tough childhood. He had a congenital heart condition that he was born with and was told at a very young age that he wasn't going to live long. In fact, they didn't think he would even make it to 30. So again, the specter of death is a part of his existence from the beginning. And throughout his childhood, he spends a lot of time in bed. He's sick a lot, but it also makes him very, very driven. He becomes a very, very driven person with the idea of trying to make as much with this relatively short life that he has. He also had a bit of luck. And that luck was that his grandmother happened to have a summer home on Rockaway Beach in beautiful Long Island. And even better, it was in Edgemere, which was a tony little part of Long Island. And this summer home happened to be next door to the summer home of Carl Laemmle. And now there's different stories about exactly what happened here and how he ends up working for Carl. One sec. The first one involves sort of stories of Carl Laemmle showing movies on the beach for people there to view his work that he's working on. The other one, which coming from a Jewish family, I think sounds a little more plausible. The Irving's grandmother got to know Carl's wife and said, "Hey, can you do my son a favor and give him a job?" That sounds like the kind of thing, of what happens. And so Irving goes to work for Universal at their New York office. And what isn't disputed, though, is the fact that very quickly he makes an impression on Carl Laemmle, and within a year, he becomes the personal assistant to Carl Laemmle. So now Irving, at the ripe old age of 19, is Carl Laemmle's personal assistant. And then another stroke of luck is in 1919, when Irving is now 20, as sort of a spontaneous last-minute thing, Carl Laemmle asks Irving to accompany him out to California to Universal City to see the studio out here. And when they get there, they find the place is kind of a mess. That's one of the problems that they've been having with the business part of it still being in New York. When messages are sent out from the East Coast to the West Coast, there's a lot of fighting over who has authority. Universal has been through 16 different managers in the first 4 years of its existence. And even though they're producing films, it's not going as well as it should. So Carl Laemmle asks Irving to stay behind when he has to return to the East Coast and look into what's going on and make some recommendations. Carl Laemmle leaves, Irving stays behind. Carl Laemmle comes back a couple of months later and gets his report from Irving, and Irving gives him a list of all these different ideas he has of what he could do to improve things, and he ends with, you need to have somebody here in charge that has your absolute authority, that speaks with your voice. And Carl Laemmle says, that's a great idea, it should be you. And he gives the job to Irving Thalberg of running Universal at the age of 21. And so now, you can imagine it was a bit of a story at the time in the trades about this young guy being in charge of the studio. And in fact, if you look at that baby-faced kid, there was a lot of stories also at this time of Irving being confused with an office boy or a production assistant, let alone, being the head of a studio. So Irving goes right to work and tries to organize things. And one of the first things he does, which worked out fortunately for him, is he has to deal with this guy, Erich von Stroheim. Yes, the legendary, one of the legendary directors of the early silent era, who sort of carried himself like a Prussian officer. And right away, Irving, in sort of to prove himself, has to deal with them. Previously, von Stroheim had made Blind Husbands for Universal, which had been a little bit of an out-of-control production, But that was before Irving came into power. Plus, when it was released, Blind Husbands made a lot of money. As always happens in the film business, you make money, all is forgiven, and he continues on his association with Universal. Well, now he starts to do Foolish Wives, and Irving is running the show, and it turns into another out-of-control runaway production. And this time, Irving steps in because he's there now, and basically he shuts the production down at a certain point. He says, "You've shot enough film. It's time to finish this movie up." Von Stroheim pushes back. They almost get into a physical altercation, but Irving holds his ground and wins the battle. And now it's a big story at the time, and he has proven himself as up to this job, even though he's this baby-faced kid. And it's around this time that Irving also starts to work more intimately with Lon Chaney, the legendary man of 1,000 faces. Lon Chaney had been around for a number of years, had started in shorts, and then started doing features, but it's when Irving puts him together with Todd Browning, a director who had the same sort of background, had been around for a while, moving from shorts to features, that things really took off for both of them, and also began to dabble into some of that darker material, which is what we're here to talk about. And first up, they do Wicked Darling together, starring then the new star for Universal, Priscilla Dean. And this film does well, and then their next production is Outside the Law, which does very, very well. And so they're both on their way to terrific careers. But it's the next one that I'm going to talk about that really puts Lon Chaney over the top. And that, of course, is The Hunchback of Notre Dame, one of the great films of the silent era. And by all accounts, it seems both Lon Chaney and Irving Thalberg were kind of at the same time interested in turning this legendary book into a movie. It had been done 6 times before, but Irving wanted to make it a huge production. He wanted to go all out and spend more money than Universal ever had before, and he convinces Carl Laemmle to do that. One of the things about Carl Laemmle was he was a little tight with the money. Universal was famous for Westerns and stuff for more rural areas, not big films, but Irving wanted to change that and decided, convinced him to spend a lot of money. And of course, to ensure that the film will do well, Lon Chaney, of course, is going to star in this film. And initially there was talk of Todd Browning directing it, but they end up going with a different director, Wallace Worsley, who had some success with Lon Chaney also, and felt was a little more seasoned for a film that's going to be made on this scale. And indeed, it is made on a crazy huge scale, bigger than anything Universal has done before. They build a massive set on the Universal lot that covers 15 acres, and to represent parts of Paris, and most famously the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The facing of it was built for this film. And there's just massive crowd scenes. If anybody has seen this film, it just has thousands and thousands of extras in it, just an absolute epic. And in fact, there were technological advances that were done, one of which is this was one of the first films that used sound amplification to communicate with all of these massive amounts of extras. You couldn't do the old megaphone thing that you would see when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of people. And then, of course, you have the incredible performance of Lon Chaney. And as this is generally considered the first film of the Universal cycle, one of the things that first happens in this film, which I'll get to in a minute, is the empathy that you feel for the character. Here we're seeing the incredible makeup that Lon Chaney does, and something else that would be part of the work going forward of Lon Chaney's and also of Irving Thalberg, is dealing with a character with physical deformities. This is something that would be a big part of Lon Chaney's work, and very interesting. Irving Thalberg would make a lot of films that way, and I'll get to those as we go forward. And I was talking about the empathy. This is one of the things that is the hallmark of this movie and of the Universal cycle. It would have been so easy to make a horror film to be monster bad, let's kill it, but instead you feel so much for the Hunchback character with the way he's treated, like this scene where the crowd is making fun of him, and then the famous sequence where he is whipped. And the character itself is just as confused about his situation as we are watching it, and you just feel so much for what he's going through. Well, the film is released on September 2nd, 1923, and right out of the gate, it does great. Gets fantastic reviews. Hunchback of Notre Dame declared a milestone. Lon Chaney triumphs. Hunchback is spectacular, and on it does. But amazingly, Irving was not there to reap any of the rewards of this. Shortly after the film finishes production, but before it's released, he quits Universal. He's been struggling with Carl Laemmle over the type of films he wants to make, and there were also some salary issues, so he decides to jump ship before Hunchback is released. And he starts working with this gentleman, Louis B. Mayer, who I'm sure is very familiar to everybody here in Culver City, of course. Well, Irving and Louis B. Mayer had struck up a friendship before he jumped ship, and they found themselves simpatico in the type of films that they wanted to make. He agreed with Irving's vision of making grander films and lifting film as an art. So in April of 1923, Irving is announced as the new head of production for Irving Thalberg. And once again, this is where Irving's luck steps in, because about a year later, of course, Louis B. Mayer Productions joins with Metro Pictures and Goldwyn Pictures, and Metro Goldwyn Mayer is born. So now Irving is 25 years old and in charge of the largest studio in the world. Pretty good for a kid who's also carrying this specter of death with him, and he works very, very hard with this massive studio to put it on the map and to do these this new vision of type of films that he wanted to do, that he found simpatico at Louis B. Mayer. And this is where the legend of the boy wonder is truly born, and this is the sort of coverage that he gets going forward from here. And interestingly, the first film that this new conglomerate puts out is called He Who Gets Slapped, and Irving reaches back into Universal and gets his old friend Lon Chaney to be in this movie. And they begin their relationship now over at MGM. And there's two other notable people that are in this production. John Gilbert, who would be Irving's best friend for many years, and of course Norma Shearer, who would go on to be more than his best friend ultimately. And this film does very well, and then Irving moves on now next to making another film with Lon Chaney called The Unholy Three, and for this one, he goes and gets Todd Browning from Universal, the director, and puts them together, and this film is also a big hit, bigger than even the other one, gets great reviews, and this begins a partnership where Lon Chaney will do about 16 films for MGM over the next 5 or 6 years, 8 of them with Todd Browning. And there's two things to note in this collaboration that now happens between Todd Browning, Lon Chaney, and Irving Thalberg. First of all, we see, again, this interest in working or doing films with characters that are physically deformed. Lon Chaney does it a lot, but it's very fascinating that Irving is drawn to this type of material. And you begin to wonder that, if you've seen pictures of Irving Thalberg, very beautiful man, looks just very polished, but inside this is a person with a damaged heart. He has a congenital heart condition, and so perhaps he feels a kinship to these characters because it's something that will continue to be a part of his filmmaking as we go forward. And then the other interesting thing is one of the films that they make is London After Midnight. And this is one of the first times that a vampire is seen in an American film, but there's a big distinction about where we're going ultimately with this that I'll get to, but it's still an important step to the journey that we're taking to horror film, or to the beginning of horror. Well, back at Universal, after Irving left, Julius Burnham was put in charge of the studio, and initially continues on somewhat in the way that Irving had been going, with taking another famous novel and making another film with Lon Chaney. And this is, again, one of the classics, the second film in the Universal Monsters cycle, The Phantom of the Opera. And this one gets shown all the time around this time of year. I think they're showing it on Halloween, in fact, downtown at the Disney Hall. And it's just an incredible film and one of the great roles of Lon Chaney. But then after this, Universal kind of reverts back. There's more changes of production heads to the more, shall I say, less sophisticated films for rural areas. And that's where Carl Laemmle Jr. joins our story, or Junior Laemmle. Well, on Junior Laemmle's 21st birthday, he was given a wonderful birthday present. He was given Universal Studios. His dad puts him in charge on his 21st birthday, same time that Irving had been in charge of Universal. But it's a very different business now. This is 10 years later. That sort of more ramshackle business has gotten a lot more organized and expanded. For one, sound has come in, which is changing everything. But also, MGM wasn't the only merger that had gone on. Several other companies had merged, and now the business is dominated by several huge conglomerates. And Universal has to fight to survive within that. So you can imagine the screams of nepotism when it was announced that this kid was going to be in charge, and how was he possibly going to do this? But it wasn't the worst idea, because Junior had grown up in the film business. He was the first film executive to have truly only known it. He was born in 1908, 2 years after his father started making movies. He was their second child. He has a sister named Rosabelle. And he was there all the time with his father while the studio was coming to life. This is a picture, if you see him in the lower right, of him at the opening of Universal Studios. He's holding his dad's hand, looking at a demonstration of a movie camera from that age. And over the next few years, he's constantly at Universal, being photographed clowning around with stars, even making a little film when he's 10 years old. And they plant lots of stories about him in the paper, just having a great time with him. So towards the end of the teens, he's just living a great life. He's referred to as the Prince of Universal City. But then, sadly, it all comes to a crashing end, because in 1918, the Spanish flu whips across America. Lots of people die, like what we went through not that long ago. It affects the film business, but it's on a personal level that it really affects Junior, because his mother, Recca Stern Laemmle, catches the flu and dies in early 1919. So Irving is now 11 years old and motherless. And you can imagine this devastates him, devastates the family, but it also draws them a little closer together. And over the next 5 years, they are constantly photographed together as a unit, whether in New York or at the studio on the West Coast, or even traveling. They're just really close unit. And then finally, when Junior gets ready to graduate high school, instead of going off to an Ivy League school like so many other people of his compatriots that he went to school with, he instead heads west and formally enters the film business. And so now at 18, he starts producing a series of shorts for Universal called The Collegians. And this is about a bunch of people going through their freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior years in college. So in essence, instead of going to college, he starts making movies about college. That's what he did. Well, his father, seeing now that Junior was going to do this with the rest of his life, finally buys a house in California. Previously, when they visited the studio, they would stay at any of the hotels around town, or they would stay on the studio lot. There were bungalows that Universal had, but now that it's clear he's gonna be in the business, he buys this old estate from the widow of Thomas Ince called Diaz Dorados, and they move in. And right away, they get known for parties. The Laemmles love to throw parties. There are so many articles in this period in the trades, in the papers, talking about different parties at their house, what was served at them, who attended the parties. Even they show up in memoirs. Bud Schulberg, the great screenwriter, was still quite young, and he, in his memoir, ends a chapter talking about going to a party at their house with the actress Sidney Fox. And then he ends the chapter with a very cryptic line where he says, they left the party before things got too out of hand. I'll leave that to you to figure out what they're getting at there. So then, with the success in the shorts, Junior next moves to making features. And I don't know if anybody here has seen this movie, Lonesome. It's a wonderful film, one of my personal favorite silent films. It follows two people who just have a crazy day together on Coney Island in 1928. And it's just one of those films, when you watch it, you feel like you really get a sense of what it was like to be alive 100 years ago. This film does well, and in fact, this is a promotional piece for the film, and if you notice it, they refer to it as Talking Lonesome. Lonesome is one of those fascinating films that started as a silent film, and then when sound swept in, they turned it into a partial talkie. So it has these three really stagey sound sequences added to it, but it's one of those films that's right in that bridge. And then at the bottom, there's another film mentioned called Melody of Love, if you can see that. Universal's first 100% talkie. There's a great story connected to Junior about this film. Universal, like a lot of the studios, was way behind the curve when sound came in, and they were scrambling to catch up. So Junior worked out a deal to borrow some sound equipment from Fox. They were a rival, but Junior worked out a deal to borrow the equipment over a weekend. Fox felt, well, what can he do in a weekend? Well, what he did was he shot an entire feature film. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's a lost film, but this was an entire feature that was shot, and it's clearly all of that energy that he was bringing to what he was doing and his embrace of the new technology is why his father on his 21st birthday gave him the studio. So, happy birthday, Junior. So he's now running Universal, and again, screams of nepotism, but to his credit, he just puts his head down, goes to work, and starts doing what a lot of kids with a rich father would do, starts spending the old man's money. And he starts doing this first by making these really expensive films. He almost kind of picks up where Irving left off and starts making these really, really pricey musicals, Broadway being one of them. If you look on the right, there's a crane there that they advertised as their $1 million crane. And if you've ever seen this movie, there's all these ridiculous crane shots that are completely unnecessary because, boy, they wanted to get their money's worth out of that crane. Just sweeps all over for no reason. And then King of Jazz, going to the next level, he makes a color musical on a grand scale. And this is a wonderful film that had a big revival about 10 years ago. And it's just a really fun film to see. And then, of course, he made All Quiet on the Western Front, the war film to end all war films. And this was a war film on a scale that had not been seen before. And this became one of those wonderful, rare movies that makes a ton of money and also gets great reviews, and in fact, wins the Best Picture at the 1930 Academy Awards. But as you can see, it's Dad who accepts the award, even though Junior made the movie. And the award is given to him by Louis B. Mayer in this picture. Well, now, with this success, the articles and the mentions of him change. There's no longer this stuff about, is he up to it or being a Nepo baby. In fact, he starts getting mentioned a lot with Irving. They're referred to as two bright young men in the film business, and then there's lots of showings, of them around town together. Here they're mentioned lunching at the Embassy Club. There's also an article around this time of them joining the Los Angeles Breakfast Club, which I believe still exists, and they had their initiation together when they joined that club. And then there were these snarky comments like giants of Hollywood are pygmies in height. So unfortunately, that was the journalism at the time. And then also, incredibly, Junior and Irving were almost family members. Irving Thalberg had an on-again, off-again relationship with Rosabelle Laemmle for many, many years, and there were even stories like this. It is rumored here that Irving Thalberg will marry Rosabelle Laemmle, but it would never come to be, but you would wonder what the dinner conversations would have been had that family come together. But of course, Irving marries Norma Shearer, and one of the great power couples of the golden age of Hollywood is born, and by all accounts, they had a very happy marriage and stayed married till the end of Irving's life. As for Junior, well, as the gossip columnist Luella Parsons put it, it's difficult for young Carl to keep his balance these days with half the ingenues ogling him, and indeed, he is all over the gossip columns, taking every actress from that era out to dinner, to a premiere, and on, very much living the life of a young, successful guy in Hollywood. And then with all this going on, this is when he makes the turn that we're all here to celebrate tonight, when he decides to make a movie of Dracula. Dracula, the novel, had been around for about 30 years at this point, but nobody in Hollywood wanted to touch it. They deemed it way too dark for American audiences. But Junior was intrigued by it, and again, Universal had a little bit of a history in it. They had made these films, but there was a big distinction in these films. What started as supernatural and otherworldly, by the end of the movie was revealed as being something done by a real person. For lack of a better term, the Scooby-Doo reveal. Right at the end of the movie, the hood would get ripped off of the person, and the Phantom turned out to be a real person doing it for greed or for vengeance. Dracula, however, was something very different. Oh, and also I want to mention London After Midnight, the film that Irving had made, was also the same thing. It wasn't a real vampire. However, Dracula is a very different story. In Dracula, this is not a guy pretending to be a vampire. He really is a vampire who can only be killed with a wooden stake driven through his chest into his heart. Pretty gruesome stuff, and that's why the studios stayed far away from it. But Junior wanted to make it into a movie. He gets the rights to a Broadway play production from 1927 that had done pretty well, and right away, everybody thinks it's a terrible idea, especially Dad. Carl Laemmle Jr. thought it was a terrible idea. So to make sure that it'll be a success, he kind of goes into Irving's playbook and reaches out and puts together a great package of, he'll have Lon Chaney play Dracula and Todd Browning will direct it. Again, they've had all that success at MGM. This way, no matter what happens with this movie, it'll be a hit. The problem is Lon Chaney dies before they can start shooting the movie. He'd been sick, he hadn't told anybody, and now Lon Chaney has passed away, but Junior was undeterred, and he finally ends up casting the Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi in the film. Bela Lugosi had played it on Broadway, but amazingly, it took a while before he got the role in the movie, because just because you're a star on Broadway doesn't mean you're one in movies. In fact, Bela Lugosi would say in later years that he was finally cast in Dracula the movie after every actor and their pets were auditioned. Yeah, so the film shoots in October 1930. Amazingly, it goes over schedule, but somehow comes in under budget, which I cannot quite figure out how that was the case, but it was. These are pictures from the shoot. That's Todd Browning, the director, on the left with his leg up, and of course Bela Lugosi. Almost in the center of the photo. So now the film wraps and goes into post-production, and Universal has to figure out how they're going to sell this movie to the public. And they come up with the tagline, "The strangest passion the world has ever known," which explains why they open it around Valentine's Day, 1931. Perhaps having a little fun and also not quite knowing what they're going to do with it. Well, of course, it's a huge hit, breaks all kinds of box office records, and Junior has been vindicated. And then this is when Junior decides to double down, and he's going to make Frankenstein next into a movie. And same reaction as Dracula. Everybody thinks he's out of his mind. His dad thinks he's crazy. My God, we're talking about bringing the dead back to life. This is really, really dark stuff. And in fact, all of Hollywood thinks he's crazy, because remember, we're now in the depths of the Great Depression. And as this article states, the Laemmles to continue with gaudy shockers instead of following the rest of Hollywood for a comedy year. Everybody felt that people wanted light fare, not dark, disturbing fare. But there was a notable exception, and that was Irving Thalberg. Because of the way Irving ran things at MGM and his desire to keep this studio at the head of every genre, even if it wasn't even quite a genre yet, he very famously calls the screenwriter Willis Goldbeck into his office and gives him a mission. And that mission is, write me something more disturbing than Dracula. So he goes off to write something more disturbing than Dracula. Meanwhile, back at Universal, Junior has to get Frankenstein going. And this has a great history of how we get to the classic film that it turns out to be, with Frankenstein being the most important horror film ever made. What you're looking at is the first piece of artwork ever created by Universal to promote Frankenstein. This is from the Universal Exhibitor book from 1931, and as you can see, it very clearly states Bela Lugosi will star in this movie. He had become a star after Dracula. There was talk of making him the next Lon Chaney, so of course, let's put him in this new film, this new horror film that we have coming along. Well, there was another star on the lot at the time, and his name was James Whale. He was an English director. There had been a big bidding war to get his services in the States when he came over. Junior won that bidding war, put him to work on the film Waterloo Bridge, was really happy with the dailies as they were coming in, and decided he wanted to get him ready for his next picture as soon as possible. Brings him into his office and says, you can have any film that we're about to shoot here on the lot, and James Whale picks Frankenstein. So now James Whale is going to direct it. We're now 2 months from when they're going to start shooting it. As you can see from this article, it still says Bela Lugosi heads the cast. A week later, that changes. Bela Lugosi, who was originally slated for Frankenstein, has been assigned a role in the Murders of the Rue Morgue. Well, again, like the story of Irving's beginnings, there's different stories about what happened here. Bela Lugosi would always claim that he quit the film, that he didn't want to be a mute character, stumbling around, the way he described the monster. In other accounts, even according to Junior Laemmle in some late life interviews, he said that he fired Lugosi from the film. Whichever one is ultimately true, he's no longer involved with Frankenstein. Enter Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff, at this moment in time, is a struggling actor. He's been in Hollywood for 10 to 15 years. He's been in over 80 movies. And all of this is 2 days at one studio, 2 days at another, maybe a week if he's lucky, and he's in his mid-40s. This is the tough life of an actor trying to get by. He's sitting in the commissary at Universal around this time, and James Whale approaches him and says, how would you like to, try out or be a part of this movie Frankenstein that I'm going to make? And of course, Karloff says yes, because, he's an actor, he needs a job. But he would also say in later years, rather cheekily, he was thrilled for the job offer, but it kind of hurt him because he happened to be dressed really nicely that day, and here he was being asked to be a monster. But of course, he takes it and begins his journey in Frankenstein. Well, now Junior doesn't have a star for his movie, doesn't have Bela Lugosi, so he reaches over to MGM to try to work out a loan out for Leslie Howard. That falls through. James Whale says, I know the perfect guy. I know this guy named Colin Clive, an actor back in the UK. He'll be great for Dr. Frankenstein. So Junior says, great, let's do it. Let's get Colin Clive to be in the movie. So now Colin Clive is going to play Dr. Frankenstein. And now things get really interesting. We're about 3 weeks now from the beginning of shooting on Frankenstein, and Colin Clive begins his journey from the UK to come to Hollywood to star as the doctor in Frankenstein. When he gets off the boat, the first part of the journey in New York, there's a package waiting for him. And in this package is a copy of the script of Frankenstein and also a letter from James Whale. And in this letter, it says Bela Lugosi or Boris Karloff as the monster. Well, what's going on? Now we're just about to shoot and we're starting to hear about Bela Lugosi again. Clearly what has happened is Junior Laemmle has gotten cold feet about not having a star in his movie and is starting to consider Lugosi again to be in this movie. You got to have a star for your movie. Shameless self-promotion. This is the period that I cover in my novel, It's Alive, all of this back and forth leading up to production. Well, of course, Karloff gets the job. The film shoots between August 24th to October 3rd. This one goes longer than expected, but also over budget, unlike Dracula, and then moves into post-production, and amazingly, 3.5 weeks later is ready to be shown to an audience. Yeah, they moved very quick in those days. The first public screening of Frankenstein is scheduled for October 29th, 1931 at the Granada Theater in Santa Barbara. It's still there. You can visit the theater. And on that day, a contingent heads up from Universal to watch this preview screening. James Whale is included, Junior Laemmle. Conspicuously not included is Boris Karloff. Who's ever heard of him? He's completely unknown. So they don't invite him. They show the film to an audience that night, and when it's done, the audience has almost no reaction and just wanders out of the theater. And the people from Universal who are staying at the Biltmore up there start to freak out. They think, what's going on? Do we have a bomb? What does this mean? Well, there's an incident that night that is perhaps a harbinger of things to come that gives them an idea. The manager of the Granada Theater gets a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning from one of the patrons that had been at that screening, and that patron says to him, if I can't sleep, then you shouldn't be able to, and hangs up. Clearly the film has landed and been effective, and sure enough, a month later when it opens on November 20th, 1931, it is a huge hit, bigger than Dracula, breaks every box office record you can imagine. If you'll pardon the horrible pun, is a monster hit. And just does fantastic business. And now all those other studios who wanted nothing to do with it suddenly decide this is a great idea to do this kind of material. This is really the big bang moment for the entire genre of horror. After this, they're all in on it. In fact, the term horror comes into existence at this moment. Previously, these films were mysteries, thrillers, shockers, but now that it's clear that these films are here to stay and a new genre has been born, it needs a name, and they're called horror films and will be forever going forward. So now everybody's scrambling to gear up and start making horror films, with an exception of good old Irving over at MGM, because he was a little ahead of the curve. So now, remember he had given this mission to Willis Goldbeck, go write me something more disturbing than Dracula. So he comes back with the script, he hands it to Irving, and then very famously, Irving reads it, calls him into his office, and when Willis Goldbeck comes into the office, he finds Irving sitting at his desk with his head in his hands and says to him, well, you did it. And of course, I'm talking about the film Freaks. This is one of the most infamous films in the history of Hollywood. And if anybody here doesn't know what it is, this is a film from 1932 made up almost entirely of circus performers who have various disabilities and along those lines. I grew up in the 70s with this film being a mainstay of midnight showings. And I remember watching this, and I had no idea that this was the product of a major studio. I would have thought, in my mind, this was whatever the equivalent of Roger Corman was in 1932, because it looked like the biggest exploitation film, ever made, let alone coming from the Cadillac of studios, MGM. And in fact, the coverage of it while it's in production, it's like any other MGM film. There's articles, Todd Browning starts production of Freaks, and then this next one is really going to shock you. Jean Harlow was going to star in it, one of the great ingenues for MGM. She doesn't ultimately end up starring in it, and it shoots right on the MGM lot like any other major feature at the time, with a little bit of an exception. There's some stories at the time that aren't the best about what was going on with all these disabled people at the commissary. Very famously, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the famous author who was working for Irving at the time, saw these people with various disabilities and threw up. Yeah, and then eventually they did set up a room to the side of the commissary where they could have lunch out of sight of everybody. So not the best treatment, but it gives you an idea of what was going on there. And then the film is eventually finished and released, and there's a few good reviews, but most of the reviews are along the line of this. It is ghastly, it is sickening, it is morbid, depressing, and wholly revolting, abhorrent, a grotesque story. Freaks lives up to its name, and Freaks has moviedom in uproar. Initially, MGM tries to play into that, sort of like, are you afraid to see it? But the film bombs and becomes one of the biggest stains on Irving's career, at least in terms of financially. The film basically disappears very quickly. And then this is where I want to take a moment just to really dive a little deeper in this, because when you think of MGM of the early 30s, this is what you think of. Not this, or this. But yet Irving was just as involved in this somewhere inside of him. And, I'm not the first one to have come up with that notion, but clearly what he felt having the specter of death over him and being handicapped on the inside affected him, because he was all in on this, which is just incredible that he was also producing films with these sort of images. Well, undaunted, he wanted to continue on trying to get a part of this new horror genre that was taking off, because he didn't like that Universal was getting it. And so I want to play you a sound clip here. Take you a second, but you'll recognize this song very quickly. And there is a reason I am playing it.
I was working in the lab late one night when my eyes beheld an
Well, of course, that's Monster Mash, the hit from the 60s. Well, the reason I'm playing that for you, if you recognize the singer is Bobby Pickett, but he's doing Boris Karloff's voice, his English accent with his lisp. Well, how did Boris Karloff suddenly become the voice of the mad scientist? He was the monster in Frankenstein. This film is part of that journey, because Fu Manchu, Boris Karloff, starts very much as a monster, but then the character quickly turns into a mad scientist. And so Irving had a big part in giving Karloff this other dimension to his career, instead of just being a guy covered in makeup, stumbling around, as Bela Lugosi would say. He also eventually had a long career playing mad scientist roles. And in fact, if you look at these pictures, they look a lot like Frankenstein, the lab scenes. That's because that's literally the same lab equipment. MGM got the same person, Kenneth Strickfaden, to also do the lab equipment in this film. Meanwhile, back at Universal, of course, Junior wanted to keep this horror genre going that he had started. He quickly makes The Old Dark House, which pairs Karloff and James Whale again. And this is a great film, kind of a spooky haunted mansion film, but he really wants to keep the monster cycle going. And the next one is The Mummy. And this is a great way to give you an idea of what had happened to Boris Karloff's career. This is now 6 or 8 months after Frankenstein has come out, and now Boris Karloff is so famous, he doesn't need a first name. He's Karloff, and his name is the size of the title of the movie. That's pretty impressive for an actor in his 40s to see that change, and you wonder psychologically what it was like to go from struggling to that in just a matter of months. In fact, Junior realized that he also had Bela Lugosi under his roof, along with Boris Karloff, the two big horror stars of this brand new genre, and he put them together in a series of films, other horror films that Universal was making at this time. And then it's around this time that Junior gives a really interesting interview to Luella Parsons. As I mentioned, she covered him all the time, the usual gossipy stuff. But she also took a liking to him and always referred to him as a man on the go with great ideas. And so she's asking him about these horror films that Universal has become well known for. And he responds, from the age of 11, I was interested in the macabre and the unknown. Well, what happened to Junior at the age of 11? His mother died. Clearly, the effect of that had been even more than just on a personal level. It affected the films that he was making and, frankly, made him aware of the monster that waits for all of us. So 1935 would be a really interesting year for the horror films and the back and forth with Universal. I want to play you quickly the trailer for Bride of Frankenstein. This Bride of Frankenstein generally considered the masterpiece of the Universal cycle, and there's some interesting things after we look at it that I want to point out to you in this trailer.
She's gone! The monster! He's got her!
So that's the original trailer, and just to go through some interesting stuff here, of course, it's the sequel to Frankenstein. The Frankenstein returns in search of a bride. We know what the film's about. Again, Boris is now so famous, we don't need a first name. And then they make a big build-up to what will the bride look like. But it's the last one, the monster talks, that's the most interesting. Famously, Frankenstein doesn't talk in the original. He does talk in Bride of Frankenstein, and they make a big deal about the monster talks. Well, does this remind anybody of another campaign from this era, perhaps a few years earlier? Garbo talks. They're having a little fun, perhaps the 1930s version of trolling with what at MGM, because there's a little more to the story. At the exact same moment the Bride of Frankenstein is shooting at MGM, they are making this film, Mark of the Vampire. This is an inside-out remake of Dracula that MGM is making at the exact same time as Bride of Frankenstein, that stars Bela Lugosi and Todd Browning. So the same two people who brought you Dracula are basically remaking it at MGM at that exact same moment. There's a couple other things in Bride of Frankenstein, too, that I think if you look at it through the lens of what was going on, I think they were having a little fun. with what was going on. I had a career, as you heard in the introduction, I wrote for the studios for 10 or 15 years, and I can tell you every meeting I ever had, the first 5 or 10 minutes was gossip of whatever was going on around town. And so they were very acutely aware of what was being shot, and I think they were having a little fun with that. Well, another interesting film from this era that MGM did is the film Mad Love from 1935. This is a terrific film starring Peter Lorre and Francis Drake. And what's most interesting about it is this is the most Universal horror-looking film not made by Universal Studios. And there's a good reason for that, because it's got a lot of Universal horror DNA in it. First of all, it's written by John Balderson, who had been one of the writers on Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man. Colin Clive is one of the leads, who of course had been in Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. And lastly, it's directed by Carl Freund, who'd been the cinematographer on Dracula and had directed The Mummy. So there's a reason it feels like a Universal horror film. It even had a prologue originally that was never used, that was very similar to the prologue in the beginning of Frankenstein, warning you, about what you're about to see. So again, now Irving has kind of pulled over some of the talent from Universal at the time. So now we get to 1936. This is not a good year for our two protagonists in this story, shall we say. It starts well enough. Junior, even though having all this success with the horror films, had never lost his affinity for musicals, and he decides to make a big, expensive remake of Showboat. Universal had done it some 8 years earlier, right at the dawn of the sound age. But technology had come a long way. He wants to redo it. Well, his father, Carl Laemmle, takes out a $750,000 loan to cover the expense of this and other productions, and he puts up his controlling interest in the studio as collateral. The idea is after 6 months, they'll pay the loan back, or if they don't have the money, they'll be granted more time. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. 6 months later, the loan is called, they can't pay it back, and Carl Laemmle is forced to sell his studio. So now, after 25 years, he sells Universal, and a month later, Junior leaves the studio. So now the Laemmles are gone from Universal, and then a few months later, Irving Thalberg dies at the age of 37. Death finally caught up to him, shockingly young. He was absolutely in the prime of his career. Several, never mind all the great accomplishments he'd had, several films, including The Good Earth and A Day at the Races, were just starting production when he passed away. One can only imagine, what 1936. Yeah, 36 is when he passes away. Same year that the Laemmles lost Universal. His funeral was a huge deal, as you could imagine. Thousands of people showed up. It was just a terrible moment, just so sad. But again, it had kind of been fated from the beginning. And then in a crazy twist, early the next year, Junior gets a job at MGM. MGM hires him, gives him a production deal, and the idea is that he's going to continue on making horror films. In fact, going completely full circle, one of the films he's going to make is a talkie of Hunchback of Notre Dame. So now it's going to go completely full circle, but that doesn't happen. And by the end of 1937, Junior leaves MGM and amazingly never makes another film. So now we're in late 37, and both Thalberg has passed away and Junior is out of the film business. The new regime comes in at Universal. They want nothing to do with horror. They don't like it. They don't want to make those films. They start working with this young lady, Deanna Durbin, interestingly, who MGM had let go, and they start making lots of movies with her, these wonderful, sweet musicals that do very well, but very different than the type of dark, interesting material that Universal had been making. And also, censorship hits Hollywood really, really hard here. And this is going to devastate the horror genre for a while. Now, just to quickly review this, one of the other aspects of these original horror films, they were part of the pre-code era. These are a grouping of films from about 1928, when sound comes in, up until 1934, and something about sound coming into movies was a combination of jet fuel and amphetamine to the images that were shown, and suddenly movies explode with drinking and drug use and debauchery that people hadn't really seen before, and movies got a little naughty. Well, as we know, when that happens, there's pushback, and groups began to spring up around the country chief among them the Catholic Legion of Decency, and they put a lot of pressure on Hollywood and said, get your act together or we're going to boycott your movies. The Production Code Administration is established, and now there's a set of rules about what can be in your movie and what can't be. This is a photograph from the period that a photographer made having a little fun with all the things you could now not put in a movie. And as you can see, these are all the things we love to see in a movie. And as horror films had a lot of this, it devastated the horror genre. In fact, for a couple of years, they pretty much stopped making them. And in spite of our smiling faces of the two biggest horror stars of the era, Bela Lugosi would go 2 years without making a movie, Boris Karloff 7 months. Just a terrible, terrible time. Then something rather wonderful happened. A theater owner by the name of Emil Ulam, who owned a movie theater right in the center of Los Angeles, not very far from here, looked around and he saw how cheap those horror films were. Nobody wanted them, so he got a hold of a print of Dracula, Frankenstein, and Son of King Kong, and he threw them up on his screen, figuring, you know, what do I got to lose? My theater's in trouble. Let's see what happens. What happened was it was a sensation. People went crazy. He had to start running the films around the clock to keep up with the demand. He realized that nobody wanted to see Son of King Kong and just wanted Dracula and Frankenstein, just started exclusively running those. And it was absolutely incredible because think about it, nobody had seen these movies now in 6 or 7 years. There's no home video, there's certainly no streaming, and it turns out there was a ton of demand. Well, that new regime at Universal saw what was going on and they were like, horror, we love horror. And they struck 500 prints, sent them around the country, same reaction. And then they decided, boy, we got to ride this wave. And they very quickly made the next film in the Universal cycle, Son of Frankenstein. And just to illustrate with you just how fast this all happened, Son of Frankenstein went from not even an inkling that they were going to make this movie to being in the theaters in front of an audience in 5 months. Yeah. That's how, once that crazy thing happened at that movie theater, they moved really fast and they starred Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. And it's interesting, now Lugosi has finally joined the Frankenstein franchise in this movie because Karloff and Lugosi had been the stars of those 2 screenings. Well, now, with this, and Son of Frankenstein does terrific business, and after this, even that new regime at Universal couldn't deny it and started pumping out sequels to all the classic horror films. And now we go through the amazing phases that this incredible cycle goes through. We started with those original films that the Laemmles made. Now we get a whole bunch of sequels, followed by a bunch of mashup movies where several monsters are in them. Then after World War II, we get a bunch of comedies with Abbott and Costello. And then we get a final little mini trilogy of the 3 Creature from the Black Lagoon films. And then the cycle comes to an end in 1956. Now, while all this is going on, as I mentioned, Irving has passed away, but Junior is still alive. And like any good American, he starts off after he's out of the film business. He joins the Army during World War II, and he serves for a couple of years. Doesn't go overseas, but he does his bit. He returns to Hollywood, and there are articles that he is going to make another movie, but it never comes to be, sadly. But a couple of interesting stories about him during this time. He starts a restaurant with his sister, Rosabelle, on the corner of Hollywood and Vine, and there was a con man going around the country pretending to be him and was marrying women, stealing all their money, and disappearing. This guy did it 25 times before he was caught and claiming to be Carl Laemmle Jr. And then one other kind of interesting parallel with Irving and Jr., at about the same time in the mid-50s, they both had an interesting, say, mini return to the movies. Universal made Man of a Thousand Faces, a biopic of Lon Chaney, and they got Robert Evans, who had a very small acting career. If you know, he went on to become a legendary producer, one of probably the greatest producer of the 70s. And Robert Evans plays him, and it seems like a really odd choice. But if you ever see the film, it's kind of fascinating because he's kind of acting almost like he's in a different movie, but it works in this case because he's playing somebody as fascinating as Irving Thalberg. As for Junior, nobody played him in a movie, but his house was in a movie. The film The Americano used Diaz Dorados, the Laemmle estate, to double as a South American Mexican cattle ranch in this film from 1955. And most interestingly, it's not a Universal film. So, perhaps they weren't ready to be dealing with Universal, the studio that had been taken away from them. Well, it's also around this time that the monsters come roaring back to life, this time when they're discovered on television. And a whole new audience discovers the horror films, and that is kids. Kids fall in love with the monster films in the late 50s, and going into the 60s, we have an incredible monster craze that sweeps the nation with model kits and magazines and TV shows. They're bigger than they ever were in this period of time. Bela Lugosi has passed away, but Boris Karloff is still alive, so he reaps a lot of the benefit of it, and he's everywhere during this time. He's on magazine covers talking about the craze. He's in movie after movie after movie. He's on TV selling everything, just everything you can imagine. And he acts in lots of TV shows during this time, and almost to the moment of his last breath, he's still acting. He even hosts his own anthology show, like a Twilight Zone, called Thriller. And then all of this craze kind of reaches a climax in 1974 with the release of Young Frankenstein. Let's put this film in context. You've got an A-list director, Mel Brooks, an A-list actor, Gene Wilder, at the absolute peak of their careers and their power. And what do? They make this beautiful, loving satire tribute to the original horror films of the 1930s. A real testament to that early work that primarily Junior, but that also Thalberg was involved in. And during this last bit of time, Junior himself, his life had kind of gotten a little bit quiet. He had been diagnosed with MS, and he was confined to a wheelchair, but by all accounts, he did still lead an active social life. This is a picture from a dinner party from 1968. He's the gentleman seated in the picture on the left, and on the right, the gentleman with the red and black tie is the legendary director William Wyler, who had started with the Laemmles, in fact, was kind of a distant relative back in the 30s, and had remained close with Junior. And after my book came out, a lot of the relatives of Junior reached out to me, and I learned a lot more about him in this period. And apparently he had a regular Sunday brunch, loved to go to the track. That was apparently a big part of his life. He loved to gamble and on. And then finally he passes away on September 24th, 1979. His death went almost completely unmarked, sadly. Most of his contemporaries were gone, and he was kind of forgotten when he passed away. But what he had started most certainly had not gone away. We have, the horror continued on in the 80s with these films being made, and let's not forget the never-ending remakes of the original horror films that Junior made specifically right up to today. Frankenstein is currently in the theaters, and we're getting The Bride next year, a remake of The Bride. So to sum up with talking about Irving and about Junior, one distinction still, like I started with, is Irving, even though he's been gone so long, is still quite lauded today. We have the Thalberg Award as part of the Academy Awards, and not far from here, the mighty Thalberg building on the now Sony lot. As for Junior, he's not fared as well. There's some mentions of him at Universal, but sadly it's more along the line of the Carl Laemmle parking lot, something that I think is a sad shame. But again, I sad but true. But again, I want to dwell on the similarities, and the similarities are what's most important, which is the fact that the two of them both aspired to make great art and succeeded, but they also followed their demons and created these unforgettable images that we're still celebrating today. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. If anyone has questions, we're open for questions.
Hello.
And I love the picture of the kid who was looking at the mummy model, because I've been buying all the reissues of the glow-in-the-dark monster models that Aurora had, so I've been reliving my childhood. My question is, a couple of the newspaper articles that popped up referred to Junior as Julius Laemmle.
Yes, he was born Julius Laemmle, and somewhere around 8 or 10 it was changed to Carl Laemmle Jr. and then Junior. Okay. There was a proclivity in that family. If you knew, the woman who lived to 104, Carla Laemmle.
yes.
She wasn't. She was Rebecca Laemmle when she was born, and she changed her name. They all kind of wanted to, lack of a better term, suck up to the boss. So.
But thank you. This was a wonderful evening.
Oh, thank you. And one thing about the model kits, just to tell you, that was my entry back in the 70s, too. I used to build those, and there's a great phrase that I wish I could take credit for, but it's not mine, but referring to those people who joined through the model kits, children of the glow. And I always thought that's a great way to describe those of us who discovered those model kits in the movies that way. So, anybody else?
Yeah, question regarding the Laemmle name.
Uh-huh.
I really wasn't aware of the deep past, and I really appreciated your presentation this evening. But for me, moving to Los Angeles in roughly 79, 80, my association with the Laemmles was the theaters.
Right.
So I don't. Do you find that connection?
Yes, there is a connection. I'm sure Mark will know this, but there was a very common phrase back then. Carl Laemmle has a very big family. He had a ton of both sides of the married couple, Carl Laemmle and his wife, the Stearns, both had lots of brothers and sisters. So there were just so many relatives. In fact, that was one of the things that Irving struggled with when he took over Universal. There was something like 70 family members on the payroll. And you can imagine if you give an order to a family member, they may go talk to Uncle Carl directly, instead of listening. So no, I think that was Edward Laemmle's family line that is the Laemmle Theaters.
So I just wanted to mention that the Mark of the Vampire, the one where Bela Lugosi actually was here in Culver City doing a horror film, part of it was filmed right across the street at MGM Lot 2. And then even on into the 70s. In the 70s, you mentioned Young Frankenstein. That was also filmed a lot over there across the street in MGM Lot 2, the cemetery scenes and whatnot. And one of my friends stole the call sheet from that from that film, and I actually made a copy of it and put it in the display case.
Oh, wow.
There, my horror display case. So.
Great.
Oh, and Bela Lugosi is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in his full Dracula outfit.
Yep.
When Laemmle started in New York, he opened a theater for what? Was it Nickelodeon?
It was. He started in Chicago, actually. He started first in Chicago, then quickly got to New York because that's where the business part of it was.
Because L.B. Mayer, he started with Nickelodeon.
Yeah, I meant to mention that he also came up through Nickelodeons also.
Yeah, and then
But L.B. Mayer had a much tougher life. He was literally a junk dealer as a teenager.
Yeah.
He had a tough, he was one of those that came up from the streets where Carl Laemmle Sr. was very comfortable in his late 30s, early 40s, and decided to throw it all away and enter the movies.
I was wondering if it was Junior's idea to film simultaneously Dracula in English and Dracula in Spanish, because I know they use the same sets and everything.
That's a great question. I just introduced a screening of Spanish Dracula, so I'm ready to answer that question. This was something about the early sound era. One of the great things about silent films was that if you had a silent film and you wanted to distribute it overseas, which was a huge market, you just swapped out the title cards. So instead of, good morning, it was Buenos Dias in South America, or my German's terrible, but Guten, whatever, how do you say it? Guten Hagen when it played in Germany. Once films got sound, you couldn't do that. And in the beginning of the technology, they hadn't quite figured out the ability to dub. They would famously, another crew would come in at night and reshoot the entire film in another language, and that's what they did with that. He was not the one in charge it would have gone through him. He was running the studio, but it was Paul Kohner who was the one specifically who was in charge of that whole division of Universal doing that. And it didn't last too long because the technology eventually caught up. And then I'm sure other people if you've talked about Laurel and Hardy here, they actually reshot some of their films themselves, speaking other languages phonetically. So that was also done.
The Spanish version of Dracula is more dynamic and is faster paced.
It is. It's about 30 minutes longer, which is interesting. It makes a lot more sense than the original Dracula. They fill in some of the holes, and also famously the women are a little more scantily clad in that one too. Sorry?
That Thalberg could release Freaks.
It-
Because it was
it-
such like, you know, it was meant to disgust and shock
I-
along
well-
the lines of like Mondo Connie and other those films of those.
It is. It's just like I said, when I grew up watching it as a mainstay of midnight showings, I just thought it was some exploitation thing.
Exactly.
And it wasn't. This was a major release from MGM. He had another phrase which tells you something about him that perhaps connects to Freaks, but he said people always like watching cruelty, which was an interesting quote to come from him, which was sort of what he was talking about with Mutiny on the Bounty, like, you know, the Captain Bligh character. But so that may have been something that he felt, because he's very good in that movie. Because Freaks not only what you're seeing, but it's not a very nice movie either, you know. It's a good film. There's a couple of sequences that are very strong. The ending is strong, and the famous dinner, you know, one of us sequence is very powerful. So once you get past sort of the reputation it has, you know. So.
An interesting side note regarding Phantom of the Opera, the man who designed all of the underground Phantom Lair scenes in Phantom of the Opera was a gentleman named Ben Carre, who lived about 2 miles from here. And he was a famous silent film art director. Both Mark Wanamaker and I are currently working on the production of a biographical feature film about his life.
Wow.
He retired from art direction, and his last film was the Marx Brothers: A Night at the Opera.
Oh.
And from then on, for the next 35 years, he was the lead scenic design, the backdrop designer at MGM.
Huh.
Until 1965, when he retired. He was, I don't believe he was credited, because he just did the sketches. He was assigned to do the sketches, mainly because he had an intimate knowledge of the Paris Opera House, having been born and grew up in Paris.
Since Junior was responsible for bringing in, you know, Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman, and they had done Werewolf of London.
Yeah.
But after Junior left, whose idea was it to let's make a Wolfman movie now?
Well, to sort of reboot it, because Werewolf of London was made. Well, Werewolf of London is interesting because it's made during that sort of golden age. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really look like the other ones. Yeah. It's a different unit at Universal, and in fact, it's produced. There was sort of a shakeup near the end of Junior's reign, where he kind of got a little demoted, and he was now sort of running his own unit. It's kind of a similar thing that happened to Irving at MGM, and they kind of did that. It didn't last as long. Junior ended up going back to running the studio, but it was Roosevelt, after not marrying Irving, married somebody else, and then that guy went to work at Universal, and he's the producer listed on Werewolf of London. And I always thought that was interesting, that suddenly Roosevelt's husband is producing horror, you know, which was Junior's main thing, because it doesn't look like one of the Universal horror films, even though it is one. And it's kind of not even, when you talk about the cycle, people kind of forget that one, and then they just sort of pretend it was never made, and then we make The Wolfman in 1940, and that's hugely celebrated, and is a much better movie, too.
Just a summary of all what you saw, and beautifully done, and knitted together, because it's very complicated, right?
Thank you.
All I have to say is real quickly is the small community of Hollywood, the Hollywood colony we call it. Everyone was involved. We're talking about MGM and Universal, but it was called Uncle Carl. Uncle Carl was like a mentor to everybody in Hollywood. At his birthday parties, everybody was there. Every studio was there, from Harry Cohn to all the Republic studios, and everybody was like, Carl was this like, what do you call it? Like not a mentor, but like the dean of Hollywood. And Irving Thalberg and Junior were like brothers practically. I mean, if Irving would have married Roosevelt, it would have definitely been in the family. But the overview of how he knitted it together, of all the films, how they kind of developed and how they ended up to even today, is fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's high praise coming from you. Thank you.
Big round of applause for Julian, please.
Thank you.
Fantastic presentation.
I